They celebrated when you left, didn't they? Little smiles, quiet comments, maybe even that ridiculous confidence people get when they think removing you from the picture somehow makes their lives easier. They thought your absence would be a victory. They didn't understand what your presence had been doing all along. You were absorbing pressure they never noticed, solving problems they never saw, keeping situations from collapsing while everyone else enjoyed pretending everything was fine. And when you finally stepped away, they mistook your silence for weakness and your departure for defeat. Funny, people often celebrate the moment they stop receiving something they never appreciated. Then reality arrives. Suddenly the problems you used to handle are sitting right in front of them. The responsibilities you quietly carried don't disappear just because you're gone. The chaos you kept under control doesn't politely pack its bags and leave with you. It waits, it grows, and eventually everyone starts wondering why things feel so different. That's when they realize you weren't just another person in the room. You were part of the reason the room stayed standing. But don't misunderstand the lesson. This isn't about watching people suffer and laughing from a distance. That's too easy. That's just another way of letting them control your emotions. The real victory is realizing you don't have to return, just because they finally understand your value. You don't need to rescue people who celebrated when you walked away. You don't need to prove that you were important. You don't need to announce, "See what happened without me." Let reality speak, let consequences teach what arguments never could, because sometimes your absence reveals your contribution better than your presence ever did. When you're always fixing everything, people stop noticing the fixing. They start thinking stability is automatic. They think the peace was free. They think the protection was effortless. Then you step away, and suddenly they discover the price of everything they took for granted. And now they're looking around wondering where the shield went, but you're somewhere else building, healing, growing, becoming someone who no longer needs to be appreciated by people who only recognize your value after losing access to you. While they finally begin confronting the problems you once quietly absorbed, the responsibilities you once carried, and the consequences you once kept from reaching them, leaving them to understand far too late what your presence had been protecting them from. They celebrated your departure because they thought your absence meant you had finally lost. Funny, isn't it? People can become incredibly confident when they misunderstand what they're looking at. They saw you step away and assumed you had been defeated, when maybe you had simply stopped volunteering for a role nobody appreciated. They thought you were leaving because you couldn't handle the pressure, but they never stopped to ask who had been carrying that pressure before. You were solving problems quietly, absorbing tension, keeping things moving, and making difficult situations look easier than they actually were. That's the trick with dependable people. When you do something well for long enough, everyone starts thinking it happens automatically. They don't see the effort anymore. They only see the result. The room is calm, so they assume calm is natural. The problem is solved, so they assume the problem was never serious. Everything keeps working, so they assume everything would keep working without you. Then you leave. Suddenly the machine makes a strange noise. Suddenly nobody knows who is supposed to handle what. Suddenly the little problems you used to catch, before they became disasters, start appearing everywhere. And now they're looking around with that beautiful expression people get when reality finally interrupts their fantasy. Wait. Who used to handle this? Exactly. But don't become addicted to that moment. That's where people make another mistake. They start watching from a distance, waiting for everyone to panic, hoping somebody will finally admit they were wrong. Don't build your future around their regret. You don't need their panic to validate your decision. You already knew why you left. Maybe you were exhausted. Maybe you were constantly giving without receiving respect. Maybe you realized that being needed isn't the same as being valued. Maybe you finally understood that protecting everyone else was slowly destroying your own peace. Whatever the reason, your departure doesn't need to become a revenge story. It can simply be a boundary, and boundaries have a funny habit of teaching lessons that arguments never could. When you're always available, people rarely calculate your value. When you're always fixing everything, they rarely learn how much you're doing. When you finally stop, reality becomes the teacher. Now they have to face the responsibilities they once assumed you would handle. They have to make decisions you used to make. They have to solve problems you used to quietly prevent, and perhaps the most uncomfortable discovery is realizing that your presence wasn't just convenient. It was significant. But here's your responsibility. Don't rush back just because the consequences became uncomfortable. You aren't required to return to the same environment simply because people finally noticed what you contributed. If they truly value you, let that value be demonstrated through changed behavior, respect, accountability, and consistency, not temporary desperation. You don't need to become cruel to become unavailable. You don't need to laugh at their struggle. You don't need to celebrate their mistakes. Simply keep moving forward, because sometimes the strongest message you can send isn't, "Look what happened without me," but quietly building a life where your energy is respected, your presence is appreciated, and your peace is no longer sacrificed just to keep everyone else comfortable, while the people who celebrated your exit slowly discover that the person they thought was easy to replace had been carrying far more than they ever bothered to notice. They didn't realize how much you were carrying, because you made carrying it look easy. And that's the cruel little joke about being dependable. The better you become at handling pressure, the less people notice that there was pressure at all. You solved problems before anyone knew they existed. You noticed tension before it became conflict. You stepped in when everyone else stepped back. You protected people from consequences they never even realized were coming. And because you didn't constantly announce what you were doing, they started treating your effort like background noise. Something automatic, something that would always be there. Then you disappeared from the equation, and suddenly the problems stopped being invisible. The responsibilities didn't vanish just because you stopped carrying them. They simply moved into the hands of people who had never bothered learning how heavy they were. That's when reality starts collecting its debt. Not because you're wishing disaster on anyone, but because consequences don't need your permission. If someone constantly relies on another person to solve everything, eventually that support disappears and they discover exactly how much they were depending on it. Maybe it's a workplace. Maybe it's a friendship. Maybe it's a family situation. Maybe it's a relationship where you were always the one apologizing, organizing, fixing, explaining, calming, and sacrificing. You thought you were helping. They thought everything was normal. That's the difference. Your effort became invisible because it was consistent. The moment you stopped, the absence became visible. Suddenly the little things mattered. Suddenly the responsibilities became overwhelming. Suddenly the person they thought was replaceable wasn't so easy to replace. But here's where you need to be smarter than your anger. Don't turn their struggle into your entertainment. Don't sit there refreshing your phone waiting for someone to admit they need you. That's another form of attachment. If your entire sense of victory depends on watching them struggle without you, then you're still emotionally trapped in the same room you walked out of. Leave properly. Let them handle what belongs to them. You handled your part for long enough. Now handle yours. Your part is rebuilding yourself. Your part is protecting your peace. Your part is learning why you stayed in situations where your contribution was expected, but your value was ignored. Your part is becoming selective about where your energy goes next. Because being useful isn't the same as being respected. Anybody can become useful by constantly sacrificing themselves. Real maturity is learning that your generosity needs boundaries. You can help people without becoming responsible for their entire lives. You can care without becoming their emergency service. You can support someone without carrying their consequences forever. That's the lesson they may be learning now, but it's a lesson you already paid for. So don't go back simply because things became difficult after you left. If nothing has changed, returning only recreates the same problem. Let actions prove whether anything is different. Let respect become consistent. Let responsibility become shared. Let people demonstrate that they value your presence rather than merely missing your labor. And if they finally understand what you were doing, you don't need a dramatic speech. A simple distance can say more than 1,000 explanations. They will either learn how to stand without leaning on you for everything, or they will continue searching for someone else to carry what they refuse to carry themselves, while you keep moving toward a life where your kindness isn't mistaken for unlimited availability. Your strength isn't treated like an endless resource, and your presence is valued before your absence becomes the thing that finally makes everyone notice what you had been quietly holding together. All along, people have a funny habit of appreciating protection only after they discover what happens without it. While you were there, they barely noticed the things you prevented. You handled the difficult conversations before they became explosions. You absorbed pressure before it reached everyone else. You noticed problems early and quietly dealt with them. Because nothing dramatic happened, they assumed nothing important was happening. That's how protection works. When it's effective, nobody sees the danger it kept away. They only notice when the shield disappears, and suddenly everything they ignored comes rushing toward them. And that's when the questions begin. Why is everything so difficult now? Why is nobody handling this? Why does everything feel unstable? Well, maybe because the person who used to quietly absorb the impact isn't standing there anymore. Not because you wanted anyone to suffer. Not because you were secretly planning some grand revenge. You simply stopped accepting responsibility for things that were never yours to carry forever. That's an important distinction. You don't need to become bitter because people failed to appreciate you. You don't need to punish them for their blindness. Sometimes people genuinely don't understand what someone contributes until that contribution disappears. It's unfortunate, but it's also human. The mistake would be allowing their realization to pull you back into the same role. Imagine finally leaving a situation that exhausted you, only to return the moment everyone starts complaining that things are harder without you. Congratulations. You just volunteered for the same problem with a new appreciation certificate. No. Appreciation isn't enough if the structure hasn't changed. If they value you now, let them demonstrate it through behavior. Respect your boundaries. Share responsibilities. Stop assuming you'll fix everything. Communicate clearly. Take accountability. That's what real appreciation looks like. Words are easy when people are uncomfortable. We need you. Things were better when you were here. Nobody understands us like you do. Beautiful sentences. But if the same disrespect returns the moment the crisis passes, then nothing actually changed. You aren't obligated to return simply because your absence became inconvenient. Your life isn't a public emergency service. You are allowed to choose where your energy goes. And maybe that's the biggest lesson in all of this. Being needed can feel powerful, but being respected is healthier. When people depend on you for everything, it can create the illusion that you're important while quietly draining you. You become the person everyone calls when something goes wrong, but nobody asks whether you're okay. You become the solution, while nobody considers the cost of constantly being the solution. Eventually, you have to ask yourself whether you're helping or simply preventing other people from learning how to handle their own responsibilities. Sometimes stepping back isn't abandonment. Sometimes it's allowing reality to teach a lesson you could never explain. Let them experience the weight. Let them discover the work. Let them understand the effort. You don't have to narrate the lesson from the sidelines. Keep your distance and focus on what you can control. Build a life where your value isn't measured by how much chaos you can absorb. Build relationships where support moves in both directions. Build boundaries strong enough that kindness doesn't become self-destruction. And if one day they finally say, "We didn't realize how much you did," you don't need to smile arrogantly and say, "I told you so." Just understand the lesson for yourself. Your contribution was always real, even when nobody acknowledged it. And your worth never depended on their ability to recognize it, while they learn through experience what your presence once protected them from. You continue forward knowing that the strongest shield isn't the one that stays in place forever, but the one that eventually teaches itself it deserves protection too. Don't return just because they finally understand your value. That's the trap. They lose access to you, reality becomes uncomfortable, and suddenly the phone starts ringing with those sweet little sentences people somehow discover only after you've stopped rescuing them. "We need you." "Things aren't the same without you." "Can you just come back and help?" "Oh, now we're important." Funny how appreciation sometimes arrives exactly when convenience disappears. But listen carefully. Their realization doesn't automatically create an obligation for you. You are allowed to hear them without returning. You are allowed to forgive without reopening the same door. You are allowed to care about someone and still decide that being around them is unhealthy for you. That's not cruelty. That's a boundary. Because if you return to the exact same environment with the exact same expectations, the same pattern will eventually return too. They may appreciate you for a week. They may promise everything will be different. Everyone is suddenly very sincere when they're dealing with the consequences of losing your help. But promises are cheap when circumstances are uncomfortable. What matters is what changes after the pressure disappears. Do they respect your time when they no longer desperately need something? Do they share responsibility when things are going well? Do they acknowledge your contribution without needing another crisis to remind them? Do they respect the boundaries you established? That's the evidence. Don't let temporary regret convince you that permanent change has happened. You don't need to punish anyone, either. That's another trap. If you spend your time waiting for them to suffer enough, you're still emotionally connected to the same situation. You're still checking the scoreboard. You're still wondering whether they finally understand. Let go of the scoreboard. Your victory isn't watching them struggle. Your victory is no longer needing to return to prove anything. You already learned what you needed to learn. You know what happens when you give too much without limits. You know how exhausting it is to become everyone's solution. You know how quickly people can confuse generosity with availability. So now you choose differently. You help when you genuinely want to help. You contribute where your effort is respected. You support people who also support you. You don't sacrifice your entire peace just because somebody calls your kindness a responsibility. And if they truly have changed, they won't need to pressure you into coming back. They'll understand your decision. They'll respect your distance. They'll show through consistent behavior that they learned something from losing your presence. Maybe someday you can reconnect in a healthier way. Maybe you won't. Either way, you don't need to force the outcome. Let time reveal what words cannot. That's what makes boundaries powerful. They don't require anger. They don't require revenge. They simply require consistency. You say what you will and won't accept, then you actually live according to it. The people who benefit from your lack of boundaries may complain. Let them. Their discomfort doesn't automatically mean your boundary is wrong. Sometimes people are upset because the version of you they could easily access no longer exists. That's not your emergency. Keep moving. Keep rebuilding. Keep protecting the life you're creating. Because the moment you return solely because someone finally realized your value, you teach them that losing you was only temporary and that eventually enough pressure will bring you back. But when you calmly maintain your decision, you teach a different lesson. Access to you is not guaranteed. Appreciation must be supported by action. And your presence is something people should value, while they have it, rather than something they can demand. After they have already shown you they didn't know how to treat it properly, leaving you free to continue forward without carrying the responsibility of rescuing everyone who only discovered your importance after you stopped doing the rescuing for them. And now you get to do the one thing they probably never expected. Let reality deliver the lesson while you keep walking forward. You don't need to chase them down with evidence. You don't need to remind them how many times you warned them. You don't need to stand there with a little victory speech saying, "I told you so." Honestly, that's exhausting, and you've got better things to do. When people finally experience the consequences of taking you for granted, the lesson becomes much harder to ignore. They discover that the stability they enjoyed wasn't automatic. The problems didn't disappear by magic. The difficult conversations didn't solve themselves. The pressure didn't suddenly become lighter. You were simply carrying more than they realized, and once you stopped, reality became impossible to avoid. But here's where your mindset has to change. Don't turn their struggle into your identity. Don't spend your mornings checking whether they're falling apart. Don't become obsessed with watching the consequences unfold. That's still giving them your attention, and your attention is too expensive for that. You already gave enough? Now your job is to build. Build your confidence. Build your discipline. Build your peace. Build relationships where effort goes both ways. Build a life where you don't have to destroy yourself just to keep everyone else comfortable. That's the real victory. Not watching someone drown after they celebrated your exit, but realizing you no longer need to be the person standing in the water trying to save everyone who refused to learn how to swim. Let consequences do what consequences do. They don't need your anger. They don't need your supervision. They don't need your commentary. If someone ignored your warnings, they can learn from the result. If someone dismissed your contribution, they can experience your absence. If someone treated your kindness like an unlimited resource, they can discover what life looks like when that resource is no longer available. You don't have to make the lesson cruel. You simply have to stop interfering with it. And maybe that's uncomfortable, because part of you still wants recognition. You want someone to finally admit that you were right. You want them to understand how much you sacrificed. You want them to say they should have treated you differently. That's human, but don't make your healing dependent on an apology that may never come. Sometimes closure isn't someone admitting they hurt you. Sometimes closure is realizing you don't need their confession to know what happened. You know what you experienced. You know what you tolerated. You know what you learned. And now you know what you won't repeat. That's enough. So keep your distance if distance is necessary. Keep your boundaries if boundaries are necessary. Keep your heart open without handing everyone the keys. Keep your standards high without becoming arrogant. Keep moving without needing the people from your past to understand every step. Because one of the strongest forms of revenge is becoming completely unavailable to the version of yourself that used to beg for appreciation, overextend yourself for acceptance, and confuse being needed with being valued. While the people who once celebrated your departure gradually discover that your absence wasn't the punishment you designed for them. It was the freedom you finally gave yourself, and the lesson reality teaches them is simply something they have to carry while you continue building a life where your energy, your peace, and your presence are no longer treated as something people can take for granted and recover. Whenever they suddenly realize what they lost,